We've been hot and cold on Fractal over the past couple of years. Their whole lineup has had consistently pretty high build quality, but our opinions have ranged from the highly rated Meshify cases that have excellent cooling potential with some aftermarket fans added in, down to the highly priced, unexciting, and generally terrible Define S2 Vision RGB, which landed on our Disappointment PC t-shirt. Today we're reviewing the Define 7, the successor to the Define R6, a case that fell on the positive end of that scale in our review. The Define 7 is one of the most compelling cases we've reviewed in a long time, so this should be a nice change of pace. Before that, this video is brought to you by us and our Charity Drive t-shirt, where 100% of the profits from the sale of this shirt will be donated to Adelaide Koala and Wildlife Hospital in Australia. The front of the shirt features highly detailed PC hardware like power supplies, GPUs, RAM, a motherboard, and resistors, banding together for a good cause. The back has a one-off variant of the GN logo made specifically for this effort. We only made about 200 of these shirts and expect them to sell out fast for the charity drive, so grab yours on store.gamersnexus.net and support Adelaide Koala and Wildlife Hospital while getting something unique from GN. So this is the Define 7 from Fractal. It's brand new today, and we've done a lot of Fractal case reviews in the past. Overall, we probably are leaning slightly negative on most of them for things like thermals, or just pricing, or being super late to trends and executing them poorly, like the S2 Vision. This one, though, is leaning pretty far towards the positive side. Thermals, still a concern. There's a door, so you can kind of figure out what we're going to say there. But the build quality really counteracts a lot of the thermal concerns, and because it's a door rather than just a panel that's stuck to the case, you can technically open it. So we obviously have open and closed testing. Now, as far as pricing, this case, when it came in, Patrick specifically, who writes the build section for these reviews, does not look at pricing until he's done. That way he can figure out what he thinks it should cost before he knows what it costs. I wrote the thermal section and I did the same. So our estimation was that it should be about a $150 case, but we speculated that Fractal would price it at $180 to $200, and that is exactly what Fractal did. So we're in the ballpark. It's about $170 plus or minus a bit depending on the version you buy. There's a clear glass version that we got, there's a tinted glass version. Some of the options on the market will change the pricing a bit, but overall the build quality is pretty good. It is sort of on the water cooling side of things. I'm trying to pop the panel off to demonstrate that it's pretty easy. So the paneling is very easy to remove, even with awkward leverage like I had, and it pops into place with some snaps that are not going to break anytime soon from what we've gathered. Now, some of these, we've had issues in the past with panels where they do break, but this one looks pretty good. Then you can swap it out for the ventilated panel that's included with it in the accessory kit that we got, at least, and change it rapidly to become a case that supports more radiators. So there's a bit of water cooling focus here. Even in the top, in the very top up there, there's a circular hole that's meant as a fill port. So if you wanted to just fill your loop a bit after you get it in there, get the air bubbles out, you pop the panel off again and just drop in the your funnel with the hose straight in through the top, and so you don't have to work at any awkward angles with taller reservoirs through the side here. So there's a lot of really small attention to detail stuff like that, where not everyone's going to use that. This is a fantastic overall setup for air cooling too, except there's thermal problems we'll talk about later. But it's still just, it's the small attention to detail stuff that we really liked with this one. So anyway, enough talking about that stuff. Before getting into Patrick's build section, I'll note that the fans, currently we've swapped them, but the fans that come with it are biased towards the top of the case. There's a big bar in the middle here between an optional optical drive and the rest of the front panel, so that does bias cooling towards the CPU, but it still suffers a lot, and we'll talk about that in my thermal section. But let's get to the build notes first, and we'll talk thermals. As soon as the Define 7 was out of the box, we noticed how lightly tinted the glass was. The Define 7 TG comes in both dark tint and light tint versions, and the light tinted version with a white interior is a stark contrast to almost every other tinted glass case we reviewed, which is most of them these days. For whatever reason, case manufacturers have tended towards extremely dark glass tints for years, which is a step back from the transparent plastic windows that were more common in the olden days, a decade ago. The choice is there for customers who want the dark tint, but we much prefer clear glass that lets the white interior shine. Speaking of side panels, the Define 7s are a combination of every feature we've asked for in case side panels so far. They hook into the case at the bottom edge so that they won't fall off when being removed. They attach and detach with sturdy snaps along the top edge, aided by a small handle on the back, and the glass panel also has a tab that can be screwed down for extra security. The glass is full coverage and has minimal black borders at the top and bottom for the largest possible viewing window. It's easy to work with, it's not unnecessarily complex, and it works well. The top panel shares the same snap mounting mechanism and can be removed by hooking a finger under the front corner and simply pulling up. The front panel of the case is a sticking point for us, as it always has been with Fractal's non-Meshify cases, but we'll save most of that discussion for the thermal and noise testing sections later. The panel isn't nearly as ventilated as it could be, but Fractal has a focus on noise damping in its cases, and noise versus thermals is always a delicate balance to strike. As long as Fractal doesn't advertise this as an airflow case and sticks to maybe noise-focused advertising, we don't need to be quite as aggressive on the panel choices as long as they pass a baseline for quality. It's when companies mismarket their product that it becomes a huge problem rather than a really annoying problem. The front is only held closed with a magnet and hinges open easily to reveal the front filter, so running the case with the door open during intense workloads isn't out of the question. You could even just remove the panel entirely if you wanted, although then you'd have 2 hinge-sized holes in your case. The hinges are constructed of metal and are therefore potentially sturdier than the ones found in the Darkbase Pro 900, which broke after we reviewed it later on, but they're still fairly delicate for the Define 7, and they're mounted to a plastic frame, so we expect this to be a potential point of failure if you're not too careful with it. The filter at the bottom of the case extends the full length and width of the case. It's accessed from the front of the case, and it can be removed easily without opening the front door of the case. And because it's accessed from the front, you don't have to move it away from the wall when you want to clean the filter, which sadly is a stroke of brilliance in case design because for some reason most manufacturers can't figure this simple point out. Anyway, that's all we could really ask for with this. The front filter isn't quite as perfect. It snaps into place very tightly behind the door, and it's tight enough that it feels like something's wrong. The handle doesn't provide great leverage for prying it off, and you sort of feel like it's going to break if you pull too hard, but that is in fact how you're supposed to remove it. The optical drive bay has a separate, smaller filter over it, which is a nice touch that allows fans or radiators to take place of the optical drive bay if the space is empty. The space between the 2 filters is still a significant obstruction though, so we'll be checking whether that matters in the thermal section later on. The top filter pops in and out more easily than the front one, and it's generously large, covering almost the entire width and length of the case. There's an unusually long and skinny fan hub tucked into the cable management channels along the top edge of the backside of the case. Fractal claims several positive features for this hub, but the one that actually matters is that it has 6 outlets for 3-pin fans and 3 outlets for PWM fans with a maximum combined total output of 30 watts. The hub takes PWM input from the motherboard for speed control and draws power from SATA for power, obviously. We didn't use the fan hub for our tests because we need to monitor fan speeds individually for accurate testing. But Fractal gets points for hiding it away so effectively while providing 9 fan connections. The positioning is one of the best uses of the top part of this section of a case we've seen in a long time, so good job Fractal on this one. Cable management is fine, and there are NDXT style built-in Velcro straps and cable channels, but they're somewhat superfluous given the cavernous interior of the power supply shroud. Even with the hard drive cages installed, it'd be hard to create a scenario where the shroud wouldn't fit every inch of slack cable. To help with this, Fractal included a plastic shield that clips over the shroud opening to keep all of the cables mashed in where they belong. At least that's what we assume it's for. Since the steel side panel can't be screwed into place, there needs to be an extra line of reinforcement to keep bulky cables from pushing the panel open. To that end, we'd like a couple extra screw holes on either the plastic cover or the steel side panel to allow us the option to screw them down tightly. And ultimately, this is unlikely to be a necessary feature for a lot of people anyway, just because there is so much space that it's not really going to have a problem of the cables pushing out against the door. The hard drive cage under the power supply shroud fits 2 drive sleds, but with so many mounting options inside the case, that's barely worth mentioning. What is worth mentioning is that Fractal has taken advantage of the extremely long case form factor by mounting the cage on rails that allow it to be placed anywhere from right against the power supply to mostly flush with the front panel. Even better, the rails can be used to mount hard drives or fans directly to the bottom of the chassis. Putting fans under the power supply shroud like this has extremely limited usefulness. Although the top of the shroud is ventilated, it's still not super useful in our testing with other cases. But Fractal was able to provide that option without taking anything away, so they did. which is a mentality we appreciate. More options is better than fewer here, as long as it's not sacrificing something else for something that's less useful. And a lot of times we get frustrated when we see that a case could easily support a 140 fan somewhere, but they just didn't drill one extra hole, and so it only supports 120s. And this is a departure from that. In that same vein, we also received an accessory kit with the Define 7 containing an entire replacement top panel. Using this panel defeats some of the noise damping features of the case, but it does allow mounting fans and radiators, vastly expanding the cooling options. The downside of swappable panels like this is that customers are inevitably going to pay for a panel that they don't use. But the ability of the Define 7 to switch from a silence-focused case with a ton of drive mounts to a liquid-cooled case with massive radiators and reservoirs at the front, or anything in between, is obviously a worthwhile thing. There's a maximum of 14 3.5-inch drives supported in the Define 7, with wide empty space at the front of the case that can be filled with racks of drive sleds, of which 4 are included. This adds to the 2 sleds inside the hard drive cage and the 1 drive that can fit next to the hard drive cage, and makes for a total of 7 drives that can fit in the stock unmodified case. We sometimes have complaints about things like drive sleds being made available for purchase separately rather than all being included in the case. But the difference is those cases often don't include any. In this instance, 7 is a lot of hard drives to start with, and it's not even really being billed as a NAS or anything like that, so this seems fine. Obviously, using the space at the front of the case for anything else like radiators or reservoirs or an optical drive will reduce the amount of drives supported. The Define 7 lists support for eATX motherboards, and it does indeed have support for motherboards up to 11 inches in width by our measurement. We think Fractal has missed a trick here, though, by not allowing even wider eATX motherboards. The EVGA SR3 that we'll be using to build a production system in an upcoming stream is an eATX board 13 inches wide. We would love to use this case for that build, but we can't. Boards of this size are uncommon, but there's very little stopping the Define 7 from fitting it. And we just praised the Define 7 for supporting things from a mentality point of view of why not, and so they don't do that here. You could mod it to fit, but as it is, the reinforcing lip at the edge of the motherboard tray and the lack of standoff holes would make it risky at best to install a larger board in this case. Fractal could sell a tray extension for the Define 7 as it is now, but the raised lip would still touch the back of the board. This is something that very few cases get right because, in big scare quotes here, eATX doesn't really mean anything when it comes to defining a width. That means if a case manufacturer says it supports eATX, that means almost literally nothing. Not quite literally nothing, but very damn close. So it's not the same as ATX, where you have a pretty defined width and height. eATX is all over the place, and you start getting to stuff like SSI EEB instead. Anyway, there are a few final minor features we'd like to recognize. The front I/O still includes a full complement of 4 USB Type-A ports, 2 3.0, 2 2.0, as well as a USB Type-C port and separate mic and a headphone jack. The power supply attaches to a frame and is inserted into the rear of the case, which is fairly common but always an appreciated feature in cases with power supply shrouds. The top radiator mounts is a removable tray, but even more so than usual, allowing most of the top of the case to be lifted off rather than just a discrete tray. We always appreciate removable radiator trays, but this one should make working with tubing especially easy. For thermal testing in this review, we're testing 4 total variations of the Fractal Define 7 alongside all the other cases. For the variations, we'll be testing the full stock Define 7, the Define 7 with the front door open and the filter removed, the full stock complement except the top panel swapped for the ventilated top panel with the door closed and filter attached on the front, and then we'll have separate charts with our standardized fans and noise-normalized thermal results. As always, we'll start with the CPU torture thermals for only the case that's under test today, then we'll get into the comparative numbers with others. The stock CPU thermal result had Fractal's stock Define 7 running comparatively hot, too hot, really, even without the airflow marketing attached. The stock configuration had it at 62.5 degrees Celsius over ambient. As you'll see in the later chart, this would put it toward the bottom of overall case performance. Fractal could improve here with better fans or with less obstructive filter design at the front, which would open up some breathing room while still allowing the door. Opening the door will drop almost 10 degrees down to 53 degrees Celsius over ambient. That's not surprising, and it's good that the door can be so easily opened, as you can always just open it for heavy workloads. What's more shocking is the extent to which removing the filter after opening the door still improves things, bringing it down to 46.7 degrees over ambient. Dropping an additional 6.5 degrees after shedding nearly 10 degrees is sort of insane. Fractal's biggest weak point in thermal design here is the filter. Although the door does worse things, we understand that not every case can have a mesh front. But the filter could be improved without even showing anything. You wouldn't know there's a difference. We'd still like to see the front improved elsewhere, like with additional ventilation or a wider spacing against the chassis. As for the ventilated top, that's about 2.5 degrees cooler than the stock configuration. Note that this will change heavily based upon how you're using it. With an air cooler, you're going to get some additional draft through the top panel when you swap it and into the tower cooler. Obviously, a liquid cooler might just require the top to be swapped anyway so that you can even get it up there. Assuming you maintain the stock configuration of the case otherwise, having an air cooler with access to holes in the top without even adding fans or changing the pressure situation at all, it's probably going to pull in air directly through the top into the cooler. Going too hard on positive pressure at the front would turn the top into a more likely exhaust, so you might lose some air out the top from the front intake fan before it ever gets to the CPU. Here's the comparative CPU torture chart. Fractal's Define 7 stock performance runs toward the bottom of the cases and is one of the worst that we've tested recently. It's unfortunate, but the positive side is that opening the door isn't really a modification or a deviation from how the case is supposed to be used. So the takeaway is basically that if you're running a high power workload, you should open the door of the case. Stock performance is nearing BitPhoenix ENSO levels of terrible, and that's all because of the door. With the door open, again, no removal of panels required, no filter removal required, it's down to 53 degrees over ambient. That puts the case next to the Core P3 as an open air chassis, the Cooler Master Half X, and not distant from the stock Meshify C, which really does need those extra fans to be truly good. This transitions the Define 7 toward above average performance, so that's a good spot to be. The craziest thing is that Fractal could throw a mesh panel on its Define 7 and create an airflow case, and it managed to be one of the best performers on the charts. We'd love to see Fractal offer an ultra-fine filter version of this case without a standalone dust filter and without a closed front panel, so just ultrafine mesh at the front, since its stellar build quality and design could be a thermal chart topper with only one panel changed. The rest of the tooling can remain the same. Without its restrictive filter or door, the case runs next to the H500M mesh and NR600 with one extra fan, and the NR600 has an ultrafine filter on the front. Fractal, if you're listening, please make another variant. No RGB though. GPU torture thermals for only the Define 7 are up now. These results are nearly identical across the board and are within test error for the most part. There's no meaningful difference between any of these results. We think that there would be actual changes to performance if Fractal had a fan positioned lower on the front that actually focused on the GPU, but without any GPU-focused fans for cooling, that means that most of the air is coming through the rear PCIe slot covers and the vertical PCIe slot covers, which is unaffected from panel changes. All of that extra air intake from the front goes straight to the CPU. There are some small frequency steps in some of these results, but nothing significant. We're talking a couple of megahertz, maybe 12 at the max. So overall, because of the pressure system in the case, the GPU is largely unaffected stock with the front panel changes. Comparatively, the Fractal Define 7 isn't particularly impressive or unimpressive for GPU thermals overall. It's not great, but it's also not anywhere as close to the bottom as it was in the CPU listing. The Define 7 ends up where the Corsair 680X is, and that's a glass-fronted cuboid-like case. And it's not far from the 220T Airflow or the Thermaltake Core P3. If you were to fit another expansion card in here, it'd potentially have drastic impact on GPU thermals, since most of the air comes through the rear of the case, and adding a card would, 1, eliminate one of those slots for air intake, and 2, obviously create a barrier. But what we're saying is that it would have a disproportionate impact in this particular case than in others, so keep an eye out for that. With capture cards, you'd want to add another front fan instead. 3D Mark thermals are next. These numbers are typically closely mirrored to the GPU thermal torture numbers, as this is a GPU heavy load, but they can be impacted by the reduction of CPU focus versus our torture workloads. The 3D Mark test loads the system similarly to how a game would load it. The power levels are the same between the CPU and the GPU, and so this is a good stand-in benchmark for game thermals that's reliable. The Define 7 ends up overall above average to good in this test. It's toward the top of our truncated chart here, with the RVO2, the H500 blank mesh, and the H710 all nearby. For a gaming style workload, the Define 7 does fine and doesn't need the door to be opened on our bench, but there's a couple things to consider here. Higher power load configurations might be different, so if you run something that does load the CPU a bit more, like if you have something in the background going that loads the CPU and the GPU while you're playing a game, or if you just have a bigger overclock on the system, with a poor GPU cooler potentially, then that could change the statement. You might want to open the door. Also, as higher power consumption components come out, that would be a consideration as well. You could easily go to a 2080 Ti and then you'd have an extra 50 watts to deal with, so that would impact things. Blender thermals are next, another real-world workload. This one is split between CPU and GPU renders to isolate the parts. Fractal's Define 7 shows itself again underwhelming for CPU performance, ranking toward the lower third of results. The Define 7 is near the S2 Vision, which is one of the worst cases we've tested recently, and near the C700P. That said, none of these are particularly bad in CPU thermals, and Blender doesn't establish much of a top-to-bottom difference to begin with. It's a lightweight load and goes to show that only the truly terrible designs, like the DTW case, are able to deviate in big ways from the mean. For GPU thermals with Blender, the Define 7 does okay and is in the middle of the results. At 25.8 degrees delta T over ambient, we don't really have anything to complain about or to praise. The CPU thermals are high, though, at 31 degrees versus neighboring results of 27, 22, and 28 over ambient, even though it's not even a CPU workload. Our standardized fan testing is next, where we replace the fans in the case with a defined set of Noctua fans, including two 140mm front fans and one 120mm rear fan. We keep the fans in the same positioning as stock when possible, as it is here, and we also mark each fan so that we know which of the two front fans goes on the top for every case test and which goes in the bottom, as their natural RPM manufacturing variants will matter for this. We have a really detailed video on all the testing methodology for this and why it sometimes isn't a good set of data and why it sometimes is a great set of data. For the CPU sorted results, the Define 7 improves from a 62.5 degrees stock to 56.2 degrees just by replacing the fans with significantly better ones. Of course, the downside to noise-focused cases is that you can often outperform them both acoustically and thermally with an open panel, since you don't have to run the RPM as high to counter the front panel. The 56.2 degree standardized fan result has it toward the bottom of the chart, second worst only to the BitPhoenix Enso. That's not a good result and reinforces the Define 7's particularly weak CPU cooling, which is its worst point of the whole case, the rest of it being overall pretty damn good. Remember, modern Ryzen CPUs will lose clocks every 5 degrees or so these numbers matter a lot these days. For GPU results, the Define 7 ends up dead center. Results don't meaningfully change from stock since there's still no fan pointed at the GPU directly, so we'll move on. Noise levels for the Fractal Define 7 at a standardized measuring distance of 20 inches, plotted 34.6 dBA with the door closed. To its credit, the door is actually doing something other than suffocating the CPU, because opening the door brings noise levels to 38.9 dBA. That said, that's not really fair to say, because you could also run the fans significantly slower and achieve the same noise levels with better than stock performance, which would be a net positive. We had a whole video on this previously, talking about some of Be Quiet's cases. Standardized thermal testing puts the Define 7 at a natural disadvantage because it's one of the only cases we've worked with that runs as quietly as it does. In fact, the Define 7 is below our 36 dBA noise normalized threshold for noise testing, plotting instead at 34.6 dBA, and that's with its included fans at maximum speed. Even still, with this noted, the case is doing better in CPU thermals than a few others on the chart. An extra 1 dBA or so of noise in terms of RPMs honestly wouldn't change much with this particular setup anyway, but it might propel it more toward an O11XL or the Helios. The GPU thermals put the Define 7 actually very near the top of the chart. This, we think, is again because the GPU intake through the rear of the case is a result of the pressure system being created and benefiting it. So overall, Fractal's on the bad side for CPU and on the good side for GPU. So that's the Fractal Define 7. Overall, we like it, but there's some asterisks there. And one of them is if you want an air cooling focused case, or by which I mean not necessarily literally air cooling, but using air to cool your computer, if you want to focus on that, then probably don't buy this or plan to leave the door open, maybe with the filter out. But door open in the very least. You can always close it when you're not doing anything load intensive, but personal opinion here, I've had a lot of cases with doors over the years, particularly back when they were really popular about a decade plus ago, and found that they were always just kind of annoying to work with. And they'd always just end up kind of sitting there open, jutting out into the room, and then you'd hit it with your knees every time you walk by. Personal opinion on that, I never really liked them. But and also from a noise standpoint, you can reduce the noise more effectively by lowering fan RPM than you can by putting a solid sheet of plastic in front of the fans and raising the RPM to counteract it. So anyway, for air cooling, you should still be looking at something like a P400A. If that's like too cheap for you and you want something a bit larger and more expensive and flashy, there are other options on the market, but Fantex does also have its updated P500A, if memory serves, from CES. That will be coming out at some point and should be priced around where this one is. So that'd be a direct competitor. We haven't looked at it yet, wait for our review. But there's options for air cooling. For cases of this build quality, in terms of build quality class, This one is in the upper echelon. It's up there with the Lian Li series of 011 cases, where just everything feels really sturdy, well built, well thought out. And although there's some flaws in places, like mostly airflow, we really didn't have much to criticize in terms of quality and execution of the construction of the case. And that's pretty rare. So overall, our recommendation goes towards the case if you are okay with the notation that you'll either be running it with the door open when you want some cooling performance, or you don't particularly need to brute force airflow. Now, an example of this would be if you decided to run an open loop in it, or even just a CLC, closed loop liquid cooler for your CPU, which is the most troubled in this testing, then you'd be able to sort of brute force your way past some of the downsides of the closed paneling. Ryzen CPUs, you're still gonna get some temperature scale every 5 degrees or so, but you'll be able to brute force your way past the bad parts of it. And so in that regard, you could probably run it closed panel with an open loop or a CLC and be fine, just obviously not as good as if it were open. What we'd really like to see is Fractal make literally this case, except with a different front panel with ultrafine mesh, so that you'd have two options, or maybe just a replacement panel, although I'm not sure that that's really possible. But that would, if they do it the way we think they could, it could very well be in the top 5 thermal performers on the charts. So Fractal, something to think about. Something if you want to deviate a little bit and get some more of our audience, that'd be a thing to do. Anyway, though, we're very happy with the build quality of the case. Fractal did well. The thermals for the CPU specifically are flawed in pretty big ways. You can sort of work with it, and it's worth trying to work with it because of the quality of the case. There's other small things like EATX doesn't really fit. They say it does, and it kind of does, but EATX doesn't mean anything. It's not actually a form factor that's defined in a really firm way. You start looking at stuff like SIEB or whatever, but the loss of some larger motherboard support for really nothing, just from poor planning really, is kind of sad, but that's common. So anyway, that's our review for the case. Like it overall. Just watch out for the thermals if you care about that stuff, because you'll be way at the bottom of the chart for CPU thermals with air cooling. But it can be accounted for. So thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly. Or if you want to not really help us, but help someone else, you can buy one of these shirts. They're brand new, and 100% of the profit is going towards charity dedicated to helping wildlife in Australia affected by the wildfires. You can learn more about that in our ad, I think, for this video. I think we ran an internal ad for this one. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.